Ah, the revolver. Truly the red-headed stepchild of all of Darktide's guns. Unloved, underappreciated, and frankly in an unenviable position, this gun had all but fallen out of the meta and out of our minds, but never our hearts. At the time of this video's recording, patch 1.110 is but a few days old, and with that patch came some pretty nice looking buffs to what many considered to be the worst gun in the game. This was largely due to having several pretty significant limitations, with little in the way to compensate for that. Its damage was weak, it was terrible against Maniac type specialists, and honestly seemed like it had nothing going for it. I'm happy to say that it seems like some of those fundamental issues have been addressed. A quick look at the patch notes, we can see that it got a fairly meaty base damage buff, its Maniac modifier changed from negative to neutral, and it got extra damage on weak spot and critical hits. At a cursory glance, these numbers seem good, but as always here on the action window, we like to go a little deeper when it comes to analysing barely used low-tier guns. So today, we'll be doing a deep dive into this weapon, and we'll be talking numbers, we'll be talking classes, we'll be talking perks, blessings, and breakpoints, and we'll be answering the question, hopefully once and for all, is this weapon good yet? Before we begin, please do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you enjoy the content. It really does help me out when it comes to the cruel malice of the YouTube algorithm. So before I start talking about perks and breakpoints and all that jazz, let's have a quick look at what these changes mean for the base viability of the weapon. The three biggest changes are: 1. You no longer have to run the unarmored perk to one-shot body shot a dreg shooter, big win there. 2. Your damage isn't totally gimped versus Maniac type enemies. This is huge for the weapon as this gun absolutely has to be good at putting specialist enemies down. And 3. The headshot modifier buff means that you can actually get some pretty alright breakpoints across a bunch of different enemies, which we will discuss now. Alright, so depending on which class you're building your revolver for, the breakpoints and therefore the builds are going to be slightly different because the veteran has access to volley fire and the Zealot does not. Big disclaimer here, all these breakpoints are tested on non-critical hits, aka reliable damage. Crits will skew these a bit, but because they are unreliable, I had to test for the worst case scenario, i.e. not getting lucky. Second big disclaimer here, all breakpoints were tested within the sweet spot of the revolver's range, and some of them may cease to be reliable over distances of 35 meters. So starting up with the veteran, I tested these breakpoints across 3 very similar but not identical revolvers, coming up on your screen now, to make sure the numbers were good. Assuming your revolver has damage and penetration in the high 70s, 25% versus Maniac and 20% versus Flak, you'll be able to hit the following breakpoints in volley fire. With volley fire, you'll also be able to 2-shot body shot the Dreg Rager and the Mauler, although for the Mauler you'll need a perfect 80-80 damage penetration roll and 25% versus Flak, or the sustained fire blessing. Unfortunately, it's not possible to hit a one-shot breakpoint on the Trapper outside of volley fire, even with 80% damage and 25% versus Maniac. That doesn't really matter for the veteran, but for the Zealot it does, as you'll see in just a moment. Talking Zealot now, you have a couple of ways you can roll your revolver. You can either go for breakpoints across flak and unarmored enemies, or you can go for breakpoints across specialist enemies. Unfortunately, you can't have a gun that does both. Remember just a minute ago when I said you couldn't one-shot a Trapper outside of volley fire on the veteran with only 25% versus Maniacs? Well, that's equally as true for the Zealot. The only way to one-shot a Trapper as Zealot is to also run 10% versus specialists, which means you don't get to take 25% versus flak if you want to have better breakpoints versus the specialists. Don't ask why, man, fuck if I know. It feels like whoever's crunching the numbers for this game is just throwing darts at a board sometimes. Anyway, the breakpoints versus unarmored are as follows. Unarmored also does get you a 1 critical headshot breakpoint versus the Dread Gunner, but being a critical hit, this one just isn't reliable, so you're better off going for 2 body shots, especially in conjunction with 25% versus flak, as parts of this enemy are flak armored. Versus flak, you get some slightly more relevant ones. So yeah, those 2 perks together is one way you can do it. However, if you prefer your stubby to have a bit more punch versus specialists, you can opt for the 25% versus maniac and 10% versus specialists instead. This gets you the following breakpoints. 25% versus maniacs also nets you a 2-shot headshot breakpoint versus the Dreg Rager, although this one isn't really important, but it's nice to know nonetheless. Okay, so blessings. Blessings, blessings, blessings. On the revolver, these can be divided into one of 3 categories, and these categories are A, utterly useless, B, mostly bad but kind of do something, and C, one or the other of these first 2 categories, but it contains the phrase critical hit. That's right, my buddies. The blessing pool for the revolver is absolute, pure and undiluted drizzling shit. When testing these, I struggled to find a single one that actually did something or affected anything meaningful. This problem with blessings isn't unique to the revolver, of course, rather it's indicative of a much larger problem with how blessings in this game have been designed, but it is especially egregious with the revolver. While most weapons have access to a blessing that breaks the mold and is so good that it's an auto take, the revolver is just rocking a whole lot of nothing. So, from the bottom to the top, here we go. Oh boy, there's a whole lot of nothing going on here. Terrifying barrage and run and gun I hope need no explanation as to why they're terrible. And as for trick shooter, well, I'll put it this way. Giving a 5% power starting on the 2nd successive chained weak spot hit on a gun that aims to either comfortably 1 or 2 shot most enemies is just absolutely terrible. This blessing is so badly designed, it can't even cap out on its maximum stacks. For that, the revolver would need a 6-round chamber. Absolutely laughably bad. Alright, moving on to the blessings that contain the phrase critical hit. So here's the dirty little caveat as to why critical hits on this gun, and generally in this game, are actually incredibly mid. They can't be depended on to occur when you need them to, so you can't build reliably around them, and unlike in Vermintide 2, where a critical hit would trigger swift slaying on your melee weapon, or ammo regen on your ranged weapon, critical hits in Darktide don't actually trigger anything, apart from literally hand cannon, which we'll get to in just a moment. Remember kids, if doing more damage does not equate to killing an enemy in less shots, then the critical hit is worthless. With this in mind, here is a list of enemies that critical hits will sometimes help kill faster. Now in the case of the first 2, a critical hit will turn a 2-shot into a 1-shot breakpoint. As for the rest of these enemies, the best case scenario I was able to achieve was a 2-shot kill on the Mauler, Mutie and Reaper, and a 3-shot kill on the Crusher. All of these scenarios were achieved with the veteran in volley fire, all of them with critical headshots except the Mauler, which was body shots, and all of them in a totally static lab environment with no ping or netcode issues and no movement from my enemy. And even then, this was the best case scenario where I was specifically grinding for this result. In reality, this high roll would be extremely hard to replicate in game and in absolutely no way reliable. So now that I've totally shat all over critical hits and their viability, let's talk about the crit blessings. The bottom dogs here are Point Blank and Surgical, just because they have unrealistic setups. Surgical requires you to stand still not shooting to build up stacks to maybe get a critical hit, and Point Blank gives you 2.5 seconds to swap to your gun after a melee kill to maybe get a critical hit. No guarantee for any kind of a payoff after the setup, so you can safely ignore these 2. Coming off slightly better are Crucian Roulette and Hand Cannon. And of these two, Crucian Roulette has the least limitations, so for me at least, it wins the battle of the bad crit blessings. With Hand Cannon, I tested it on this revolver, and I was able to get my rending crits up to 1250 damage, which was almost enough to two-shot a crusher. I wasn't willing to lock the blessing slot on my 80/80 revolver, so I can't say for sure, but at 80 damage and penetration and tier 4 hand cannon, you might potentially be able to hit a two-shot critical headshot breakpoint against the armored Chungus. Finally, we ascend to the giddy heights of Shit Blessing Mountain, and here we can find the creme de la creme, or the cream of the shit, if you will. Glory Hunter, Speed Load, and Sustained Fire. Now all of these actually do something. Glory Hunter gives you toughness, which is always kind of useful. Speed Load is easy to set up and does add some extra speed to the revolver's lengthy reload. And Sustained Fire actually helps making 2 taps against certain enemies on certain revolvers more reliable. I know what you're thinking. These are the best? And yeah, I know, I'm thinking that too. All of these blessings are so fucking miserly, it's as if Ebenezer Scrooge fucking designed them. Congratulations! You made it to the end of this video without drowning in a deluge of revolver information. Good on ya. Overall, this video took days of testing and grinding for materials to make multiple revolvers and several revisions to make sure the information was accurate. So after all of that, what's the final verdict on this bad boy?
B tier.
That's right, even with the buffs and perfect rolls, this weapon is still very average. On the Zealot, it's outshone in its niche by the Cantrell shotgun, and on the Veteran, it's outshone in its niche by a lot of other weapons. Out of the 2 classes I tested it on, I definitely think that it feels more at home with the Zealot, as that class's playstyle gets the revolver into ranges it wants to be at. With the Veteran, this gun felt like a struggle, especially versus rooms full of Dreg shooters and gunners at any amount of range. It's maddening to still not get the one-shot on these enemies at range because you hit an arm or a gun. An issue I encountered a fair bit. Now, don't let this dissuade you. These buffs definitely bring it more in line with the rest of the arsenal, and it's definitely good fun to use, but I'd be lying to you if I said it was better than B tier. It's a little sad because I feel that had Fatshark either upped the damage or weak spot modifier ever so slightly more than they did, it'd be in a stronger position. The real crime of this weapon is just how irredeemably shit its blessing pool is, but then again, that's a criticism leveled at the awful crafting system as a whole, rather than specifically this weapon. Anyway, this video has gone on for far too long, so let's call it here, my little Johnnies, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.